Okay, well, it's about 2:30 Central Time. Once again, we've been going through a series of presentations on ancient history in the Bible. In the last few weeks, we've been talking primarily about ancient Israel, and we're going to conclude that today for the time being. We'll come back to it later when it's more appropriate, but right now we're going to conclude it. And today we're going to talk about two periods of time in Israel. We're going to talk about the divided kingdom era, where the country of Israel was yanked from Solomon, and there was a period of about 200 to 300 years where the kingdom was divided. And then, of course, both of them were overrun and taken into captivity and went through what is called the exile period for a short period of time. And then there was a period of time from about 520 or so BC up to the time of the Alexandrian period in the 300s, where the Israelites were allowed to return to Israel or Judah and reestablish the temple. And that's called the Post-Exolic Era. And that's what we're going to talk about today, those two eras. And then we'll, like I said, that will kind of finish us up for the time being on ancient Israel, and we'll switch gears. I'll talk a little bit more about that as we get to the end of the lesson. So let's do a little review. What did we learn last week? Well, we learned that due to destruction of Jerusalem on two different occasions, we have limited archaeological evidence of the United Kingdom. We talked about the United Kingdom last week. So because Jerusalem was almost totally destroyed at least twice, it's really hard to find a lot of evidence, but there was evidence there. We also learned that due to the Islamic control of Mount Moriah, which is that high place in Jerusalem where Abraham was going to sacrifice Isaac, and God stopped him. And that became kind of a holy site, obviously, to the Jewish people. Since that area is strictly controlled now by the Islamic people that control it, they will not allow any kind of archaeological evidence or excavations going on in that area. We learned that the ruins of Saul's capital at Gibeah provided evidence for the existence of King Saul. Pardon me. We learned that the Tel Dan Stele is the first historical mention of King David in the Bible, a very important piece of archaeological evidence, because up to this point, a lot of people said, well, David really probably, if he existed at all, he was probably just a little warlord. No, he was a very strong king, and this stele, this black granite piece of stone that they had engravings on, kind of proved that. We learned that the ruins of David's palace at Kirbet Kayefa, overlooking the valley of Elah, where he's, according to the Bible, killed Goliath, provides us evidence of David's power. We also learned that an archaeologist, Eliat Mazar, has unearthed what's called a large stone structure in Jerusalem, which very well could be the remains of King David's palace. They're not saying that 100%, but it's very likely. We also learned that the excavations of Solomon's stables at Megiddo, the plains of Megiddo, and his copper mines in the Negev desert south of Jerusalem provide evidence of his reign. So, and we also learned that Eliat Mazar has unearthed what may be Solomon's wall in Jerusalem. So, as we saw last week, then there's quite a bit of archaeological evidence to support the Bible's narrative that Saul and David and Solomon not only existed, but were powerful kings. So, what happened to Israel after Solomon? Well, that's what we're going to talk about today. Here's the quote, the Bible quote for the day. The young men who had grown up with him, Rehoboam, this is who followed Solomon, replied, "These people have said your father put a heavy yoke upon us, but I will make your yoke lighter. Now, but make our yoke lighter. Now tell them, my little finger is thicker than my father's waist. My father laid upon you a heavy yoke. I will make it even heavier. My father scourged you with whips. I will scourge you with scorpions. This is the guy who followed Solomon. This was his son. So what happened in the Bible was, according to the Bible, once he assumed control, the northern parts of the kingdom were pretty upset with the way they had been taxed and had been forced into building the palace and the temple and whatever. And they said, okay, your father's gone. Now, please release us from some of the burden. And he said, no. His young advisors told him, you tell him that you're going to be even tougher than your father. And when it says, I will scourge you with scorpions, that's not a literal meaning. What that means is a whip that has metal tips on the end was called a scorpion. And so when he says, I will scourge you with scorpions, he's talking about whipping them with a metal whip, whereas his father only whipped him with leather whips. Again, in the New Testament, when Jesus was scourged by the Romans, they used a scorpion to do that. It's a very nasty piece of equipment, to say the least. A little bit lighter, my cartoon for the week. King Solomon had 700 wives, Ed, and you just have the one. Surely you can work out your differences. Thought that was pretty cute and definitely says something, doesn't? Okay, so we've seen then that although Solomon was a strong king, unfortunately, he had a weakness for women. As the Bible said, I've just told you, he had 700 wives and 300 concubines. Most of these marriages were political marriages. Most of them he married daughters and maybe nieces or whatever of different warlords and kings. He even married the daughter of the Pharaoh of Egypt. And he basically they were marriages to consolidate his power. But there was a problem. Most of these wives brought with them their pagan idols and their practices. And as it says in the Bible in 1 Kings 11:4-5, as Solomon grew old, his wives turned his heart after other gods and followed Ashtoreth and Molech. These are two of the Baal gods. And Yahweh was not happy. And he said, in response, the Bible says he decided to tear his kingdom away from Solomon's descendants. He told the priest that talked to Solomon, he said, for the sake of his father David, I will not take the kingdom away from him while he's still king. But when he dies, the kingdom will be torn asunder because of his, inability to keep worshiping me. So when Solomon died in 930, he was succeeded by his son Rehoboam. Rehoboam operated from 930 to 911 BC. However, the 10 northern tribes, as I said, were not pleased with the imposed taxes and forced labor imposed upon them by Solomon. And it became apparent that Rehoboam would continue, as you saw in the quote there. They revolted, and the guy by the name of Jeroboam, who is not one of Solomon's sons, he was just one of the rivals to Solomon, became the king of Israel. So the dominant tribe of Judah plus Simeon remained loyal to Rehoboam. The kingdom of Judah was formed. So what you had now was a divided kingdom. The northern kingdom was called Israel, and it would last for over 200 years until destroyed by Assyria in 722. The southern kingdom became known as Judah, and it would last a little over 300 years until it was destroyed by Babylon in 586. So this is kind of what it looked like. Up here to the north, you had the 10 tribes that made up Israel, and its capital was at Samaria. The southern country was Judah, and it was made up of Judah and the Simeons. To the east, you had the Syrians, the Ammonites, the Moabites, the Edomites. To the west, you had the Philistines, and up here you had the Phoenicians. So you had a divided kingdom, and they did not work well together. They didn't play well together. It was could turned out to be quite a problem. So let's kind of look real briefly at an overview of the two kingdoms and exactly what happened there. First of all, let's look at the northern kingdom, which I said lasted from about 930 to 721 BC when the Assyrians finally took them over. In 930 to 986, the kings of Israel were pretty ineffective. And even though they had some power, they faced a lot of harassment, both from Israel and from Syria. In 886 to 843, you had rulership of a period of kings that formed a dynasty called the Omri Dynasty. And in the Bible, it says that Israel became strong and prosperous during this period of time. So even though these kings were not good kings in terms of being followers of Yahweh, they nevertheless prospered and they became strong. And this was because, according to the Bible, that God intended them to rival Judah. So the reign of Ahab and Jezebel, you also the prophets Elijah, Elisha, and Obadiah served during this period of time. Of course, we know a little bit about Ahab and Jezebel, and we know that Ahab was a follower of Baal's because of his wife Jezebel, who happened to be a daughter of a high priest of Baal from Phoenicia. From 843 to 804, for a period of about 40 years, you saw the rule by Jehu and Joahaz, and Israel threatened at that period of time by the Syrians. Pardon me while I get a drink, folks. Sorry. Throat's a little dry. So once again, they kind of got weak. And then there was a period of about, 60 years or so that Israel reached its greatest height under Jeroboam II. It was really, really strong at this period of time. This is when you saw Jonah and Hosea as prophets. So this was when the books of Jonah and Hosea would have been set. Finally, from 749 to 722, the northern kingdom pretty well fell apart. And the Assyrians captured it. And King Hosea, not the prophet, this is a different king. King Hosea served as the last king of Israel, and then it was taken captive, and many of the Sumerians, as they were then called, were taken into captivity and dispersed throughout the Assyrian Empire. If you look at an overview of Judah, the southern kingdom, it lasted about 100 years longer. So there was a period from about 930 at the death of Solomon to about 850, period of approximately 80 years, where Asa and his son Jehoshaphat ruled Judah, and they were really strong. I've always marveled at the name Jehoshaphat. I can remember my mom. She wouldn't cuss, but she had words that she would use that were just as strong, I think. And one of them was jumping Jehoshaphat. And I bet some of you have heard that from some of your parents or grandparents. And Jehoshaphat and Asa were very strong and prosperous kings. Unfortunately, they were followed in 850 by a king and some of his followers called Jehoram, whose wife was the daughter of Jezebel. There was a period there where Judah and Israel kind of began to work together. And Judah faced a lot of threats then from its neighbors. Not surprising that they begin to drift away from God. This is when the prophet Joel wrote his book and served as the prophet, the book of Joel in the Bible. 787 and 732, you had a period of time when the historical Hebrew religion was kind of restored in the southern kingdom under Uzziah and Jotham. And Judah reached probably its greatest height then. It was really, really strong under Uzziah and Jotham. Unfortunately, it wouldn't last. And Amos, the prophet, served during this period of time, and his book is written about that period of time. And he warns Judah that it's not going to last, folks, because unfortunately, the tendency for the Hebrews were to drift away from God. They would become near to God, and then they would the next generation would just begin to drift away, and the next one would really drift away. And then God would have to punish them again. And in 741 to 726, they became a vassal to Assyria. Same period of time that Assyria destroyed the northern kingdom, the southern kingdom just paid them money, and they left the southern kingdom alone. This was when you had the reign of Ahaz. And then from 726 to 697, you had a revival again. Once again, you had a strong king come in and begin to promote the Bible, the Old Testament, and return to the worship of Yahweh. That was King Hezekiah. And Micah served as his prophet. Remember when we talked about the Assyrians, King Sennacherib assaulted the city of Jerusalem, and Hezekiah was found a way to bring water to the city. And even though Sennacherib was strong and he had all these real strong warriors, they were unable to break down the walls of Jerusalem, and he had to return to the Assyrian capital beaten. Although he didn't get beat, he just could not do what he wanted to do. And the result was he got killed by his own sons. And then doom befell the southern kingdom. 697 to 586 BC, you had a 55-year reign of Manasseh. The Bible says Manasseh was the worst of all of them. He said he was absolutely horrible. He brought in all sorts of Baal worship, and I may be mistaken, but I think there was even child sacrifice during this period of time. He was so bad that the people turned away from him at the end, and Josiah came into power. Josiah actually reformed the country and brought it back to Yahweh. So what you see in the southern kingdom is kind of an up and down roller coaster period going on here in this divided kingdom. Eventually, Judah was overwhelmed by the Egyptians and the Babylonians, and the people, the Israelites and Judah, were taken captive by the Babylonians. And this is when you have what we talked about a couple of weeks ago, the Babylonian captivity, where the Israelites were taken into Babylon, and you had the prophet Daniel and some of these people talking. During the period of Josiah and Manasseh's reign, you had Isaiah, one of the greatest prophets of the Old Testament. You had Zephaniah, Nahum, Habakkuk, and of course Jeremiah, who was really warning the people about the incoming doom, that what was going to happen. So this is kind of an overview of the two different kingdoms. This is a picture of the old ruins of Samaria. You remember in the New Testament that the Jews in the country of Judah, Israel, down in Jerusalem, they absolutely despised the Samaritans, and they would have nothing to do with them. They would avoid even walking through their land. They wouldn't talk to them. They wouldn't eat with them. They would have nothing to do with the Samaritans. The roots of that division lie during this period of time. You might also remember that Jesus just absolutely blew away his apostles. Remember, he meets the woman at the well who was a Samaritan, and she offered him water. And the apostles came upon this, and they were just flabbergasted that he would actually be talking to a Samaritan. And he used that as a teaching point to said, basically letting them know, my word is for all. It's not just for the chosen people, it's for everyone. And this is when you begin to see the building of Jesus's testimony to go out to the Gentiles. So that's a very powerful moment in the New Testament. So, do we have any archaeological evidence that supports anything in the divided kingdom era? Well, we actually do. there's something called the Misha Stele, sometimes called the Moabite Stele. It was discovered in 1868 by a missionary in present-day Jordan, but frankly, nobody could read it. So it just kind of sat there for a while, and people didn't know exactly what it was they had. They knew they had something old, but they couldn't tell what it was. Well, finally, someone was able to translate it, and lo and behold, this stele, this stone monument or engraving, which they always did, the kings did to kind of proclaim all their greatness, told a story that absolutely parallels the episode in 2 Kings chapter 3, which provided information about the political relationship between Moab to the east of Israel and Israel in the 9th century BC. It's the most extensive inscription ever recovered that refers to the kingdom of Israel, specifically the house of Omri, and it bears the earliest extra biblical reference to Yahweh, and it also refers to David. So, again, the first time that we see the word Yahweh in writing, other than from the Bible, is on this Misha stele. And it also, just like the Tel Dan stela, only a little bit later, mentions the house of David. So again, two extremely important pieces of archaeological discovery here. The inscription tells how Chemosh, the god of Moab, Chemosh was their primary god, he was a fiery god, had been angry with his people and allowed them to be subjugated to the king Omri of Israel. So apparently, according to this stele, Omri, or the King Omri of Israel, had been able to subject the Moabites. And Chemosh, however, finally returned and assisted the king of the Moabites to throw off the yoke of Israel and restore the lands of Moab. Now, look what it says in 2 Kings, 3rd chapter, verses 4 and 5. Now, Misha, the king of Moab, had to pay the king of Israel tribute. After Ahab died, the king of Moab rebelled against the king of Israel. So look at this. You've got a stone inscription from the Moabites that talks about Yahweh, that talks about the house of David. It talks about how Misha threw off the yoke of the king of Israel, which would have been Ahab, and revolted and overpowered the Israelites and forced them out of their country. Exactly what it says in 2 Kings chapter 3. So extremely important piece of archaeological evidence, really supports the stories, the narrative in the Old Testament about the divided kingdom. So it's a pretty important piece of archaeological discovery. And then it says the Israelites invaded the land and slaughtered the Moabites a little bit later on. So the Israelites eventually ended up overpowering the Moabites at that time. By the way, if you want to see the Misha stele, now housed in the Louvre and Paris, France. And again, this just goes to something that we've talked about before. There's really a lot of controversy about many of the archaeological artifacts that have been dug up, not just from the Holy Lands, but from everywhere, that have been taken into the West. And people say, they really should not be there. They should be housed in the country. They belong to the countries from which they were taken. And I understand that. And to a degree, I agree with that. However, I think we also see from what happened a few years back with ISIS, where they destroyed so many things that had anything to do with Christianity or Judaism, that they're probably not safe in some of these countries. Remember some of the things that we lost during that reign of ISIS in Syria. We lost Jonah's tomb, we lost the gates of Nineveh, we lost just several different important archaeological finds that were housed in these countries, and they just destroyed them. They didn't want to have anything to do with them. They thought that they were heathen and pagan, and so get rid of them. And so it's probably not safe to return some of these things to some of these countries. This is the Misha Stone. If you were to go to the Louvre and go to Paris and visit the museum, you could find this. And again, very important because it's the first extra biblical reference to Yahweh plus another reference to the house of David. Now, the main difference between the two kingdoms was religion. When it boils right down to it, folks, that's what it was all about, was religion. Jeroboam, the founder of the northern kingdom, really feared that the Israelites would continue going to worship at the temple. In Judaism, it was kind of required that you go to the temple if you could for different festivals like Passover and festivals like this. It wasn't a requirement, but it was something that was really stressed that you really needed to do it if you could. Well, Jeroboam feared that if he didn't do something different, remember he had split these 10 tribes away from the southern kingdom. So he decided that he was going to introduce a new type of worship, and he adopted calf worship as the state religion of Israel. This is an old religion, come from Egypt. Remember when Moses was leading the Hebrews through the wilderness, that there was a period of time there that when he was up on the mountain, Mount Sinai, receiving the 10 Commandments and having his talks with God, that the Hebrews became so upset and thought that he had abandoned them that they wanted to return and they wanted a God to lead them. And so Aaron actually melted down gold and they forged this golden calf to worship. That was a calf called Bess. We'll learn about Bess a little bit later when we talk about Egypt. But this is what they did. They adopted calf worship as the state religion. And he established religious centers at Bethel in the south and at Dan in the northern part of his kingdom, kind of like temples. So you could go there and worship this golden calf so they wouldn't go back to Jerusalem and worship Yahweh. This was the whole point, was to keep them from returning to Israel, because he was Judah, because he was afraid that they would return to Jerusalem, that they would kind of, once again come under the power of Rehoboam. So he said, no, we're going to do it all different. We're going to have a new priesthood. We're going to have a new God. We're going to have the golden calf. And so here's what the Bible says. After seeking advice, the king Jeroboam made 2 golden calves. He also had shrines on high places at Bethel and Dan and offered sacrifices on the altar that he had built. So he basically created a new religion. It was Baalism in a sense, but their god was a golden calf. You can imagine Yahweh wasn't too happy about that. In addition, there was a tendency for the Israelites to join in the worship of this Canaanite deity Baal. The Israelites just went back and forth with their belief in Yahweh. They tended to basically follow Yahweh, but then they would fall out. His worship, as I've said, was actively promoted by Ahab and Jezebel. And of course, we know what happened to Ahab. He was killed, and Jezebel even suffered a worse demise when she was basically thrown out of a window by some of her slaves and was devoured by dogs, just like it said in the Bible was going to happen. Judah, the southern kingdom, in principle, continued to worship Yahweh, although there were some kings like Manasseh that just absolutely drifted totally away from Yahweh. So what you had in the southern kingdom during this period of time was kind of an up and down roller coaster. Sometimes they would worship Yahweh, sometimes they wouldn't. And the worse it got, the more angry God got with them. And finally, he just said, enough is enough, washed his hands and let the Babylonians come in and completely take over the country of Judah for a short period of time. This is the remains of a Baal temple in Samaria. This was up in the high places. They always built them on a high hill. And again, if you read in your Bible, the high places were kind of a code word for Baalism. It wasn't something that the people were supposed to do, was go to the high places, because that was kind of a code word for Baalism. So we have the exile period now. This is the period when the northern kingdom was taken into exile by the Assyrians, and then about 100 years later, the southern kingdom was taken into exile by the Babylonians. And they were dispersed throughout these two kingdoms. And we talked about this when we talked about the Babylonians, and we talked about Nebuchadnezzar and his dream and Daniel and whatever. So in 722, the northern kingdom was overrun, and Samaria, its capital, was destroyed. Many of the Israelites were taken captive and dispersed around the vast Syrian Empire. Most of them never returned. Some of them actually were dispersed into Jerusalem, believe it or not. In the 9th year of King Hosea, the king of Israel captured Samaria and deported the Israelites to Assyria. That's what it says in 2 Kings 7-6. In 586, basically 120, 130 years later, the southern kingdom was overrun, and Jerusalem was destroyed as well, as just like Samaria. So this was the first destruction of Jerusalem by the Babylonians. They didn't totally destroy it, but they tore down the temple, they tore down Solomon's palace, they tore down any of the big buildings. They didn't take everybody into captivity. They only took the leadership, the powerful. I told my group here when we were doing this, I said I would have been left behind. They left the poor, the downtrodden, those who had no power. They left them there. They only took the powerful, the leadership, to Babylonia. That was a lot of them, but they only took those people. And again, most of the Jews were dispersed around the Babylonian Empire. A lot of the top leaders were taken to Babylon themselves. This is called the diaspora. This is the first and second diaspora. The third diaspora comes, the big one comes when the Romans destroyed Jerusalem between 66 and 70 AD. And the Romans just totally destroyed the city of Jerusalem, down to the foundations. And they just absolutely destroyed and dispersed the Jewish people throughout their empire. And that's when you have the main diaspora of the Jewish people. It says in the Bible, he, Nebuchadnezzar, this is not Nebuchadnezzar, set fire to the temple of the Lord, the royal palace, and all the houses of Jerusalem. The commander of the Babylonian guard, carried into exile the people who remained in the city, along with the rest of the populace and those who had deserted to the king of Babylon. 2 Kings 25, 8-12. This is when you see Ezekiel prophesying during the exile period. You see Daniel, you see Jeremiah. If you read those books of the Bible, that was all being written about the period of time of the exile period. So this is an archaeological excavation in Jerusalem that shows the period when it was destroyed during the period of the Babylonian captivity. I'm not going to lie to you. I have no idea where this is. I just know that it's an archaeological site within the city of Jerusalem that is indicative of the period of time when Jerusalem was destroyed. You'll notice how deep it is. You notice that the ruins that we're talking about here are really below ground level. When these cities were destroyed and when they were rebuilt, they basically just leveled out the ground and rebuilt on top of the ground. And so some cities just have multiple layers, and you have to dig down through the layers to get to certain layers of the city. Jericho has been destroyed 17 times, and Jericho has 17 layers in it. You can imagine how hard it is to do this. Of course, we know that eventually the Jews, at least in Babylon, were allowed to be released under Cyrus the Great, the Persian king. And he basically said, you can go back to your homeland, to your country, you can rebuild your temple, and you can have your country again. He did this because several different reasons. He had a lot of respect for the Jewish people. He also had this feeling that you trap more flies with honey than vinegar. And he knew that if he treated the Israelites right, they would follow him, and they would be loyal to him. And they were, folks. The Israelites basically, from that point on, as long as the Persians were in power, they didn't give the Persians any trouble. They were very much honor bound to help the Persians. They didn't go out and fight for them, but they definitely didn't give them any trouble. So after about 40 years, after the Babylonians had carried the Jewish leadership into captivity, the exiles were given the opportunity by the Persian king Cyrus to return to Judah and rebuild their temple. There were actually 3 returns. The first one was in 532, where the vast majority of returnees went back to Jerusalem. It took them about 4 months to walk from Babylon to Jerusalem. Once they got there, the Persian governor, remember, his name is Zerubbabel, and you can read in the Bible about him. He led in the rebuilding of the temple. He wasn't a Jew, but he was following kind of the honor system of Cyrus, and he said, Cyrus, our great king, has told you you could rebuild your temple, and he actually gave them a lot of money. You also see during this period of time quite a division going on, because some of the people that lived in Jerusalem during the exile were Sumerians, and the Jewish people did not want to have anything to do with this remnants of the northern kingdom. They offered to help rebuild it, and they told them absolutely not. We don't want to have anything to do with you. You're not going to help us build this temple. You weren't a part of our country because you left it. And it got to be really bad. In fact, the case building on the temple was halted for quite a while, actually several years, until finally one of the followers of King Cyrus, one of his sons called Cambyses, actually allowed the work to begin. Under Darius, work on the temple resumed and was completed in 516 under the leadership of the Jewish prophets Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. So if you read in the Bible, if you read the books Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi, they're prophesying during the period of the reconstruction of the Second Temple. 458, the prophet Ezra led the second return of exiles. And then finally, you had a very small group of exiles return in 444 BC, led by Nehemiah. And this is when you have the books of Ezra and Nehemiah written. Actually, as I recall in my study, I think Ezra and Nehemiah were actually considered to be one book for a while, and they finally split them up when they were kind of devising the canon back in the period of the 300s AD. So Nehemiah came in, he rebuilt Jerusalem, he rebuilt the walls of the city. The second temple was rebuilt. Now, it was quite a bit smaller than the original first temple. It was only about half as big. It wasn't nearly as luxurious, or it lacked the splendor of the first temple. But, in a way, that's how they meant it to be. It also lacked some of the very important things that had been in the first temple. For instance, it lacked the Ark of the Covenant. The Ark of the Covenant had disappeared, as well as the pot of manna and Aaron's rod, and of course the stone tablets, the Mosaic tablets of the Ten Commandments. All these were lost. So instead, what they put in the Holy of Holies, this part where only the priest could go and where the ark always sat before, was something called a foundation stone. And this foundation stone was kind of the part of the original temple. And they placed it in the Holy of Holies to kind of serve as a remembrance of the ark and its contents. For the next 100 plus years, the Persians allowed the Jewish leadership to participate in the governing of Judah under the benevolent Persian leadership. So for about 100 years or more, you had basically a theocracy where the Jewish priesthood ran the country. And the Persians led them as long as they paid homage to him, and they did. They didn't worship him as a god, but they definitely said, "You're our king." We accept the political leadership of the Persian king. We follow Yahweh, our God, but you are our political king. This all came to an end in 332 when Alexander the Great overthrew the Persian Empire and consumed control of the Persian Empire. We're going to talk about the Alexandrian period later when we talk about the Greeks. So this is where I'm going to kind of stop talking about ancient Israel. We're going to take it back up later, and we're going to talk about this period from 332 until about 60 BC when the Romans came in. And this is called the Ptolemaic or the Seleucid period. This is the period of time when you had the Maccabees. Again, us Protestants, we don't read the book of Maccabees. It is in the canon of the Israelites, the Catholics. And so they're very familiar with the book of Maccabees. We aren't familiar with it if you're a Protestant. I'm going to talk to you about the period of time of the Maccabees and exactly what happened, because it's a very important period in Jerusalem's history, because it was the period of time right before Jesus came to be. And so you can kind of see what was building up here when Jesus came up on, when he was born and had his ministry in Jerusalem. This is kind of a replica of the Second Temple. This is what the Second Temple would have looked like. Very much smaller, only about half as big. Was not nearly as magnificent as the first temple. This is the temple that Jesus would have gone to. When in the New Testament talks about Jesus cleansing the temple, when Jesus went there and preached in the grounds of the temple, this is what he would have gone to. This is what it would have looked like. Not the first temple, this is the second temple. This is Nehemiah's wall. It is still standing. This is the wall, the partial wall that was built around Jerusalem when Nehemiah and the exiles returned to Jerusalem. So this part of that wall is still there. Very important archaeological discovery. So, real briefly, everybody always wants to know what happened to the ark. Well, of course, we've all watched Raiders of the Lost Ark, so we know what happened. Indiana Jones found it during the Second World War. Well, no, he didn't do that. Be honest about it. The simple answer is probably the most logical answer. It was taken over by the Babylonians when they came into Jerusalem in 587 BC, when they tore down the temple. They probably took the ark. They probably threw all this other stuff away. They thought, who cares about these pieces of rock and this wooden staff and this box full of whatever it is, looks like, wafers. So they just probably threw those away. They probably took the ark back to Babylon and melted it down. That's the logical thing that happened. There are other people who believe there are possibly other results of the ark. There's some Jewish scholars that believe that King Josiah gave the ark to Jeremiah, the prophet, prior to the Babylonian siege. Remember, Josiah was the king at the end of the period of time, but right before the Babylonians took over Jerusalem. And according to some Jewish scholars, he took the ark. He knew that Jerusalem was going to be destroyed. And he gave it to Jeremiah, and he told Jeremiah to hide it. And they believe they took it to Mount Nebo. And in Second Maccabees, this book that us Protestants don't read, it says, then he, Jeremiah, went away to the mountain from the top of which Moses saw God's promised land. When he reached the mountain, Jeremiah found the cave. He dwelled in the tent, the ark, and the tent of meeting, the ark, and the incense altar into it, and blocked it up. And supposedly these scholars says that they will be returned when Jesus comes back the second time, when the Messiah comes. This is from the book of Maccabees. Nobody knows, there's no knowing if that happened or not. Some people believe it was taken to Egypt, where it stayed for quite a few years, and then eventually was taken to Ethiopia. There's a little church in Ethiopia at a town called Axum who claims they have the ark, and they have 24-hour guard on it. There are priests that watch over it every hour of the day. And they basically say, we have the ark, but they won't show it to anybody. Who knows? I will tell you this, there's a very strong Christian community in Ethiopia. They're called Coptic Christians, and they're very strong. There's another group of people in Zimbabwe, in southern Africa, called the Limba people, and they claim their ancestors carried the ark south from Yemen and hid it in a dark cave in South Africa. Now, most people just kind of laugh at this when they say, oh, this is silly. Well, it may not be that silly, because somebody did a DNA profile of these people a few years back. There's only like 40 or 50 of these Limba people left. And they claim to be the descendants of these Jewish people who hid the original ark in Yemen. And sure enough, their DNA profile fits the profile of the Levite people. Yeah, there's evidence to linking him to the Levite tribe. So I don't know, but all I know is that we don't know where it's at. There's another group that believe the Knights Templars took it, housed it in Chartres Cathedral. Some say it's in a little small cathedral in Ireland. Some people say it's in the United States. Like I said, the most logical thing that happened to the Ark of the Covenant is probably it was melted down for the gold. That's the simple thing. Okay, that pretty well concludes it. Next week, we're going to shift gears. We're going to start talking about Egypt, and we're going to talk about how Egypt played along with the Bible as much as we can. So that's where we're at today. Thank you. I hope you've learned something.
Thank you. Oh, sorry, Donna.
Thank you. I remember hearing Jumping Jehoshaphat when I was growing up.
Yeah, I've heard that.
And that's very interesting. Thank you, Tony.
Very interesting.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Tony. We'll see you next week.
Okay.
Bye, everybody.
Okay.